And I told the Fin Com recently that the issue is something new that Moody's did this year and will do annually in March. And it's not associated with a bond sale. So it's kind of an interesting free-form comment from the rater. And one thing it says that's kind of interesting is on the first page of that comment. I think it's the first page of your handout, right?
This is mine.
Debt and pensions. It says the debt and pension burdens of Concord are affordable, yet they are weakness relative to its AAA rating. That's kind of interesting. The last piece of that particular handout is the set of questions that the rater asked me at the most recent bond rating conference. That's a telephone call, and people get called in New York, and they don't come here. And it lasted about 45 minutes in this post-2008 crash environment. The rating conferences, even for, they used to be 5 minutes, basically, and they've now lengthened to 45 minutes. They're pretty thorough, but you can get a feeling for the kinds of questions that are asked, some of which will be talked about in here. The other thing I handed out to you was a compilation of some statistical data prepared by First Southwest, who is our financial advisor, the company that assists us with the preparation and marketing of our bonds. And it has a lot of charts and graphs about specific information, and I think it's kind of illuminating to see where Concord falls in that fraternity of AAA rated communities. That's this here. So, this is first an orientation from the Finance Committee, but not solely. That's why I invited other people here. So let's turn to the Finance Committee first. The members have seen this stuff before, but just file it and talk about it once a year. On page 1 of your administrative code, there is virtually nothing in the statutes that says what the Finance Committee does, except that communities of a certain size must have one. Our charter picks up after that statute, which is like 1930s statute. And Carrie, feel free to comment. And everybody knows Carrie LaFleur, who is the incoming new CFO for Concord.
Welcome.
I'm very happy about that. Lots of but the charter creates our Finance Committee as a 15-member body. It establishes that the moderator is the appointing authority. Our unwritten law in town says that members have 3-year terms, and if they serve 2 3-year terms, they're off. So 6 years, they're off. Sometimes that gets spent a little bit when somebody fills a year of a vacancy. Then they can get 2 full terms, and they may end up serving 7 years, but then they quit after 5, saying I've had enough. And that's true for all of our committees. Uncharacteristically, this town has very few elected officials. Only the select board, school committee. The regional school committee is the Concord School Committee plus 2 Carlisle school committee members, board of 7, and the moderator. That's it. There's nobody else elected. And the charter has been in effect since 1955. So you are familiar with the Town Governance Study Report. You've seen that, or probably read parts of it or all of it. It was our first full-scale review of our town government functioning under our charter, and they essentially ratified the existing structure, which is a small town, which is a strong town manager form of government, where the town manager is appointed by the select board, and the town manager is the chief executive officer, with hiring and firing authority over all non-school staff. And that's set forth in this administrative code is what the Finance Committee does, goes into, and it has not been rewritten in a long time. The last amendment in 1992, the Finance Committee wants to undertake a rewrite of its administrative code someday. That would be an interesting exercise. Bylaw, there is also a town bylaw from 1920. Which organizes and sets forth the role and structure of the Finance Committee, and says what the Finance Committee will do. Section 3, when the warrant contains any article or articles under which an appropriation or expenditure of money or the disposition of any property of the town may be made, the Finance Committee shall make a report, make a recommendation. And then it goes on to say, this is sometimes ambiguous to the committee, should we or shouldn't we, you're not restricted to only money articles. Anything else in the warrant that you want to offer the town a judgment about or recommendation, you're free to do. The issue of whether something has monetary impact is really quite broad. It doesn't necessarily mean a specific appropriation of dollars. And then your standing vote of 1976, page 5, says that you shall establish a budget guideline, and you shall issue it to the select, now the select board, the school committee, and the Concord Carlisle Regional School Committee. Notice that you don't really issue a guideline to the Minuteman Tech, and as a practical matter, although it doesn't say it here, your guideline has always been about the appropriation that's before town meeting. That means the general fund, tax support fund.
Can I clarify that for just a second? So the guideline process does not really encompass any exempted or exorbitant debt?
It covers debt because debt is tax supported.
Okay, so it's the full gamut then?
Sure, but it doesn't cover, let's say, the recreation department. You're not setting a guideline for the recreation fund. You're not setting a guideline for the water fund per se. However, we put everything in front of the finance committee.
Okay, fair enough. Right. Okay.
So we've interpreted those kinds of things not as restrictions. And then from time to time, Alice, pick up an item there on the table, Alice. Pick up one of the 3 items. We're looking at the blue binder right now. On page 6, from time to time, finance committee chairs have picked up pen and tried to write down what it is the finance committee does. And this, what you have in front of you is the latest such attempt in 2013 by Lynn Salinger. And I think it's a useful, just brief summary, quick summary of what you do, when you do it, how you do it. On page 9 is the town organization chart. The citizens, as I've said, elect the moderator, the select board, and the school committees. I've made that plural, but they only elect 5 members of a school committee. Those school committee members then, under the Concord Carlisle Regional School District Agreement, serve also as school committee members of the regional school committee, along with the 2 Carlisle elected members. The school committee hires a superintendent. We have what's called a joint superintendency. We have a K-8 local school district, Concord Public Schools, and a high school regionalized. Those 2 entities, the regional high school is a separate political subdivision. It's equivalent to the town of Concord as a political subdivision of the Commonwealth. So is the Concord Carlisle Regional School District. It is not run by the Concord Finance Department. It is not run by the town manager. It's run by the superintendent, and it has its own treasurer. And the deputy superintendent is in charge of the district's finances.
Relative to the governance chart that you have here, I just am not familiar with any recommendations that were made in the governance study that was done of the town of whether or not it would be prudent for us to separate the school committees into really discrete staffing. Right now, it's a merged function, so you vote for a person and they sit on both committees. Do you know what the recommendation is?
It was discussed.
Yep.
And they decided to make no change.
No
from
change.
the present
Okay.
structure.
All right.
And the involvement with the Minuteman Tech is what? Any
Minuteman Tech, just like Concord Carlisle Regional School District, is a regional school district. It is its own entity, its own governing body. Under our charter, the moderator appoints the member of the Minuteman Tech School Board from Concord. And the school superintendent manages the school department, and they divide the operation of the CPS it's a joint administration, but they divide the transactions, the finances, the management of the Concord Public Schools and the Regional School District, because the Concord Public Schools legally is a department of the town. And in fact, all of the Concord Public Schools financial transactions come through this office, come through the town hall. They manage their local financial affairs, if you will, but the Concord Public School K-8 is a department of the town for the purposes of the town's financial reporting. The Regional School District is not. We are assessed our share of the net Regional School District budget, the portion that doesn't come from their state aid, which they receive directly, and from their other revenues, which are not major. Everything else is an assessment to the member towns, and we're fortunate to have only 2 member towns. Any more than 2 gets complicated. We're complicated enough as it is. So that's reflected here. The moderator appoints the Finance Committee and the MMRHS representative. The Select Board appoints the various boards and committees that you see on the left. The Town Manager appoints the Town Council and the various boards and committees that you see on the right. The Town Manager's boards tend to be the operational boards, if you will. The Light Board, the Board of Assessors, the Public Works Commission, the Recreation Commission, etc. There are a couple of asterisks there that says the Board of Assessors, the Historical Commission, Natural Resources, and the Committee on Disability. The Town Manager appoints, but only with the approval of the Select Board. So he recommends an appointment, and the Select Board have to vote.
Why would those be different than the other boards?
Probably because either because there might be a statute. I don't know if there's a statute about historical commission or not. That we had to dovetail our charter with some other state laws, but something like the Board of Assessors, I would imagine that way back in '55, that was a pretty contentious appointment. It's probably still pretty contentious, but and it was felt that there had to be that elected official oversight in a more direct way. That's my surmise. Since it works, I've never bothered to delve into it more deeply than that. And the town manager manages all the town departments and is the appointing authority for every employee in them.
Not shown on this are any of the various housing functions. There's like the housing trust, there's the housing corporation. I think that's actually elected directors or something. I
possibly could, but the town manager doesn't have a direct role in those. So the housing authority, of course, is a state agency.
State agency.
The housing trust is a private agency.
Okay.
They do fundraising, but they're not part of the town.
They're not part of the town.
The Concord Housing Development Corporation is also it's a public corporation, but it's a separate, independent corporation. The only role in the statute is that the selectmen appoint the board members. The Act says they do not have day-to-day control of what the CHDC does. So it's not a committee of the town, but it is connected to the town. It's something the town, in fact, did itself as a home rule petition.
Right.
To ask the legislature to create this entity in the belief that, and there were town committees before that were active in affordable housing, in seeking to promote affordable housing.
Right.
Without abundant success. And it was felt by the town back in 2005, 3. It took several years of discussions, in fact, that this would be a more fruitful way to go about the promotion of of the development of affordable housing. Verdict, you can make your own verdict about where that stands, but they have done some significant things over the 10 years that they've been.
But they stand outside the town even though their directors are appointed by the select board.
So, in page 10 is the organization chart of the town departments. Those that report, and the reports directly to the town manager. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 people report directly to the town manager. That's a significant number.
It is.
When I started in Concord, the town manager had 20 direct reports.
Brutal.
So there's been a little improvement. Actually, we're about 9, but in recent years, there were 9 for a long time. In recent years, the town manager decided that the IT director would be a direct report to the town manager, and I forget the other one that changed, but now there are 11. On page 11 is the specific organization of the enterprises. Now, enterprise is a term we use loosely when we give you what we refer to as our enterprise budgets. An enterprise, strictly speaking, is a business-type operation where you have physical assets and you do depreciation accounting just like a private business would, and the objective of the entity is to maintain and improve the capital plant and provide the service that capital plant was built for. So our true enterprises are really only the water department, the sewer department, the light department. Solid waste is kind of a hybrid because it doesn't have any physical plant to manage. We also I'm sorry, I missed one. The Beatty Swim and Fitness Center. It has a building. That building was, of course, a gift to the town. The town didn't build it. But we accepted it as a gift, and therefore it's now a physical asset that we have to worry about. And so the operation of the Swim Fitness Center is a full enterprise, where its fees and charges are intended to provide for both the operation and the maintenance of the physical facility. That's the difference. A recreation department is not an enterprise. It is not responsible for the physical plant that it uses. The general fund is. The taxpayer is. So that's the difference, where you expect the users of the service to pay not only for the operation, but also for the maintenance of the physical plant without tax support. Our water fund, our sewer fund, our swim and fitness center, and our light plant do not receive taxpayer support. They're funded by the ratepayers. We put other documents in here, other funds in here recently as the solid waste and recreation, because they are significant activities. They're not quite businesses, but they're not quite the other thing either, which is general services. And so to give them greater visibility, and they're significant dollars, they've in recent years been put into this report as well.
Something like the library, Mead Center, and some of these others, there's a contract with the independent entity and the town?
Media Center is not an independent entity. It's the town, except it's an enterprise. It's paid for by the users. but it's it's under the town manager.
What would happen if the rates don't meet the expenses?
Well, then it'd be up to the town meeting to decide upon someone's recommendation that they're going to give it general fund money, give it taxpayer-supported money. That can be done, that's permitted. But if you're operating an enterprise, that's not what you intend to do. What you intend to do is to support it by the users. In the future, if something happens and the taxpayers need to come to rescue an enterprise, it's permitted. And in the accounting, it's treated as contributed capital. And it's part of the assets of the enterprise once it's paid over. In fact, when we launched the Beatty Center, we had to equip the place. There was a general fund bond before the doors opened of $500,000 to provide the original equipment. So things are never pure as the, they're pure. There's always some wrinkles around the edges.
But if there's a need for capital improvement, that has to go before the town
Yeah.
meeting.
Beatty is different than all of our other enterprises because it followed the enactment in 1989 of a new state statute that said any municipality that wishes to create an enterprise from here on after has to do it under a new state law, under a state law that now says that the town meeting has to appropriate the annual expense. That's why the Beatty comes to the town to the town meeting as an appropriation, where the others don't. We have articles for water, sewer, and light, but if you read them, they don't make an carefully, you'll note that they don't make an appropriation. They simply say, the town manager is authorized to spend willy-nilly. They don't use those words, but the town manager is authorized to spend the proceeds of the funds for the purposes of those activities. You can't spend the proceeds of the light fund for the police department because for the light plant, there is a body of law, Chapter 164, that governs municipal light plants. For the water fund and the sewer fund, there are town bylaws that were passed in the 70s that govern the use of those funds. And so they're restricted to water purposes or sewer purposes, nothing else. But you give annually the town manager the authority to spend those funds. It's not that you're adopting a budget. We do, however, show you a budget. We didn't always. This started in 1994. It started when one of our honored citizens, Hugh Lauer, and one of our finance committee chairs, John Cole, got together and said, we don't know anything about these operations. We need a budget. So that's how that happened. It was because I dreamed it up.
So in terms of the enterprise funds, I see that the rating agency did ask a couple of questions
Oh, yeah.
about them, but how
Great question.
how much do they review those?
A lot.
And what are the issues that they're looking at with regard to the enterprise funds?
They look at them because all of our debt obligations are general obligation debt. We don't issue revenue bonds.
Okay.
The statutes would actually allow us to issue revenue bonds, where you could issue a bond for the light plant's improvement, and you would say in the covenant of the bond, only only the rates from the ratepayers shall be used to pay these bonds. Well, I'll tell you immediately, they won't be AAA, because we can say we're always going to have the rates, but that's not credible. Instead, we backstopped it with the full faith and credit of the town. And so that
So-
debt is AAA debt as well.
So relative to the recent bond issue that was done for the water on the Gog Pond, which did not require a two-thirds vote because it's being funded by the rate, by the capital.
Does
No,
require two-thirds vote. Does require two-thirds vote because all debt, under the state laws, all debt authorization requires two-thirds vote of town meeting. All debt, regardless of how
Okay.
you intend to pay for it.
okay,
We can say, we intend to pay for it from the water rates.
Right.
That's just our intention.
right.
From
Okay.
the standpoint of the bond buying community, it's all general obligation debt.
It is general obligation
From the
debt.
standpoint of the state law, it's all debt that requires
Two-thirds.
two-thirds vote of town meeting to be authorized.
Okay. I'll have to go review that. I thought I asked a question at town meeting relative to that very question, but I'll go back and think about that.
Go to the tape.
I'll go to the tape.
But great question. And the rating agency wants to know that we in fact are operating that way. We can say we're going to operate that way, and we can even say on the telephone call that we are operating that way, but they're going to look at these documents and verify it. And so track record is really part of a credit rating. Credit ratings have inertia. It's hard to get a rating increased. It sometimes takes a while of bad behavior to get a rating decreased because there's inertia on both sides of that process. We'll go into credit rating a little later. Maybe right now. The town has a AAA credit rating. That does not mean that the town is wonderful. The rating agency is interested solely in one question. Are the bond buyers going to be repaid? Are they going to be repaid without by the town, without undue stress on the rest of the town's operations? So that's the question they're asking. If the only way we can repay our debt when we say, when it's due, is by cutting staff or curtailing services, that's a significant negative factor in a credit rating. So what they're saying about when they give a rating is, this community can repay the debt that it's proposing to sell without undue stress, or with a level of stress that's appropriate to this level of credit. Same thing as when you go to get a loan or a mortgage, right? It's really the same process. Can you pay it? Can you pay it back? That's the question that a lender always should be asking. The rating agency is an intermediary between we want to borrow and somebody else wants to lend us money. And that's the question they're asking. So it's not about being wonderful. It's not about performance. They'll look at our statistics and our data and our track record, as portrayed in the financial statements, but they know very little about whether we fill our potholes the day after they emerge, or whether we do anything else well or poorly. They look at other data that tells them that. So they will say things, you'll read in the credit rating report, the community has been willing to pass overrides when requested. If the community consistently is not willing to pass overrides or debt exclusions when requested, that would be a negative factor in the credit rating, because that tells the rating agency the people feel stressed. People are not willing to spend more, even though the town officials or the town meeting thought it was a great idea to spend more. So they look at ancillary data, not
Employment contracts, that type of thing?
employment contracts. I mean, collective bargaining?
Yeah.
They don't look at our collective bargaining in detail. They ask about, as you see in these questions, do you have any contracts that are years and years, not being settled? You know, if we had an environment where we had strikes, they probably would ask about that. So they look for those secondary measures as evidence of, hey, this community ain't doing so well, or the people don't think they're doing so well.
Tony, what kinds of, talk a little bit about the term of the debt. You know, how far can you go out, and how do you, I assume that you would say, well, the appropriate term is going to be the life of the asset, but how much wiggle room is there?
Right.
Things like that.
The term of all of our debt is constrained by state law. Of course, much of it is, much of the provisions of state law would allow much longer terms than we choose to use. So, for example, if you want to build a school building and it's supported by MSBA participation, you can borrow for 30 years. We haven't done that, but other communities have. If you want to, so it's really based on there are 40 different clauses in Section 7 of Chapter 44 and Section 8 of Chapter 44 that tell you first what you can borrow for, and if you can't find it in that, if you want to do something and you want to borrow for it, and you can't find it anywhere in those clauses in the state statute, you can't do it. And each of those clauses will tell you, you want to do this, you can do it, you can borrow for a maximum of X years. So you want to build a road, you can borrow for a maximum of, that's probably 30 years again. I don't think there's anything more than 30. So if we wanted to do a Walt Disney bond for 50 years, we couldn't do it. If you have if you have a piece of equipment, I think it's 15 years, or maybe it's longer now with the oversight board. But if you want to do just a plan, you want to issue a bond to plan for a future capital expenditure, you can only do that for 5 years unless it's directly connected to the building, the construction. So the law sets those limits.
And do the rating agencies give you credit for paying the debt for taking a shorter term?
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. So getting back to, what's the credit rating about? It's really about four things. It's about, what they look at is four categories of things. Debt factors, how much, how long, is it for the right, is it allowed, how quickly are you going to repay it? And there must be a question in this memo, what are your future borrowing plans? Well, that's question 2. They're right there. What are your future plans? So they want to know not only what you are offering to sell right now, but what you have in mind. And so if you don't have a capital plan, that's probably a negative factor in rating. If you can't tell them, yeah, we're looking at $30 million over the next 5 years. And we have this potential for a $20 million building, but that'll have to be a vote of the people, and so forth and so on. If you can't tell them those things, that's a negative.
And how often do you have to come to market to keep them happy?
We issue a bond annually. Not everybody does, and there are highly rated communities that don't, but if you were only coming to the market once every 5 or 10 years, that probably wouldn't be a positive thing. So I'm in the camp that says, and I think this is true in private life as well, if you don't borrow, you can't borrow. So if you exercise your rating, then the market knows you, the market anticipates you, the market looks at you more favorably. But that has its limits, Again, we come to market annually, but we come to market with a rational program. And we talked about this last week. It is possible to overdo it. And we're at a level of outstanding debt that is roughly in line with what the rating agency says. That's what a where a AAA credit should be. If we had twice as much outstanding debt, that would be a problem. And they made I pointed out the comment that they made. The debt and pension situation, level is actually a weakness. They made that statement. I hadn't seen that statement before in that way.
So they'd be talking about the unfunded pension liability?
They're talking about both, they're beginning to talk about all of our long-term liabilities together. Our debt, our OPEB, our pension liabilities, all together. And they're looking at the whole picture. Not just our bonded debt.
Do they use the same figure for the pension liability that we use, or
No.
do they use their own?
They use their own.
Okay.
And for this last credit rating, for the credit rating report, you'll see some numbers in there that are not for their analysis of our pension liability. Those are not our actuaries' numbers. They take our actuaries' numbers and then they lower the discount rate because Dan has been talking to them. And they used, this past one, they used a 5%.
Oh, wow.
So significantly lower.
Significant.
We're 7.25 now?
7.
We're at 7.
So yes, they're doing that for everybody, whether it's Lexington or Chelsea, and coming up with their number and then saying, how does this look to us, both comparatively and in absolute terms, as to the town's ability to ever meet this obligation? And so we're on the good side of that comparison.
In terms of the rating agencies and the enterprise funds, they obviously want to see that they're healthy. The rating agency would want to see that the enterprise fund is healthy. On the other hand, if it's too healthy, then the services that it's charging for, I guess what I'm thinking is that I would want to be charging more for the services, because then I don't want to subsidize the enterprise funds, because the services are being paid for both taxed and non-taxed participants.
30% of our utility base is non-taxable, is tax-exempt property.
Right, so how do we allocate expenses so that we are have a fair payment in terms of the rate basis, and that we
Yeah.
have a fair presentation to the agencies?
Right, so.
It's a balancing act.
We showed them this book as well. And in each of the funds in this book, there's a section about the interdepartmental charges. What the utility is being charged, what the enterprise is being charged, whether it's BD or water, sewer, light, for the central services that they're receiving. Light plant doesn't have its own finance department, doesn't have its own
Right.
treasurer.
So how do you allocate
And so we have.
your Tony Legalbo
Right.
to,
We have a regime of,
Oh.
whether it's by proportion of time, or in the case of how do we allocate the human resource office, it's basically fundamentally about the number of employees, because that's really where the HR's workload comes from in terms of recruitments and employee
So you,
management. So each of those charges has a methodology. And our practice for a long time has been that the methodology is negotiated between the department providing the service, finance department, and the department receiving the service, water department, saying, here's what we are proposing to charge you. Here's the basis on which we're proposing to charge you. And if there is a dispute, it goes to the town manager. That's how we work our budget. There are not that many disputes. From time to time, there are. From time to time, a department will say, why do I have to pay for a portion of natural resources? What do I have to do with natural resources? And then the natural resources director will explain to the water superintendent why what the natural resources department does might be important to water quality, and so forth and so on. So they have that discussion among themselves, and it doesn't rise, and we catalog it, and we illustrate it in here. And it's typical, it ends up being typical, overhead. When you look at the actual aggregate numbers, it's not an unusual, total that you would expect for central services provided to these other devices. For our non-enterprises, we basically don't do that. So we're not allocating treasurer or finance director time to the recreation department.
right.
We are, however, saying recreation department, you're going to pay all of your labor costs, whether they're in your department or not. You're going to pay your share of group insurance costs, or the OPEB costs,
But when,
or the pension costs.
we as a committee are
costs directly
looking,
related to employment.
so when we as a committee are looking at the operating budget and the guideline and recommendation of guidelines for that operating budget, that in some sense is incorporating some of the enterprise,
When you set the guideline, you're only setting the general fund dollars.
the general fund
You're only
dollars.
setting the general fund dollars. When you look then at the town manager's tax-supported budget, and you open up to treasure collector, say, you see what is a part of your guideline, the general fund, on the first line, and you see all the other allocations from all the other funds, making up the division's total budget. In fact, treasure collector is the one I used in here for the study. So the for the treasure collector, the light fund is paying 11% of the treasure collector division's costs. Why? Because the treasurer collects the light bills.
Right.
Like, occasionally somebody's going to walk into, Route 2A office with a bill and payment, and they have to send it over to the treasurer. There's no separate treasury over there. So we're providing services, whether it's billing and collection services and customer service here at the town hall for that business. And they pay for that. The parking meter fund, we collect the parking tickets here. We do all that work here. We do all the appeals here. So on and so forth. So in each page of this book, you see that allocation. Underlying the allocation is a set of rules about where do we get this number from. And it's either based on allocation of time of specific staff members, or sometimes other methodologies that the department, the charging and paying department have agreed upon.
So to bring that back full circle, if you're looking at a department of the town that is a fundamental provider of services, like HR, do they have a certain amount of their budget that's funded by the general fund? And then they have line items that say, oh, and we get this much money from this enterprise, and we get this much money from this other enterprise, and we get this much.
It's not, from their perspective, it's a total number.
It's a total number.
It's a total number.
All right, so, okay. So,
From the perspective of the treasurer, the division's budget is the bottom line, $498,000. That's the number they manage.
okay, that's their number that they manage. And the way that that's presented in the budget book there is that they are funded by this much general fund money, and then these other line items that show money coming in to fund their operation from these enterprises. That's all I was asking. That's fine. So I get that. All right.
But we as finance committee members
Just worry about the general.
are looking at the general fund
When you
number.
set a
We don't
guideline, you're looking at the general fund.
see all those other
Not in the
components.
guideline, but you
Not
certainly
in the
see it in the
guidelines.
budget.
In the budget book, yes. But we,
Because your focus is the taxpayer
right,
and the impact on the taxpayer. General fund is $90 million. The total town operation is about $130 million. So the general fund is, three-quarters of the total.
Yep.
And most of where you see these other funds is in the serviced
Right.
areas.
and in.
You'll look at the fire department and you won't see anything other than general fund money.
Right. But the growth in revenues or the growth in expenses for the general fund has been growing at the same pace as the expenses for the enterprises, or are they growing? I mean, how do you, what has the trend been looking like?
Yeah, the trends, because the rules have stayed mostly the same, the trends have been very proportional.
Okay,
Yeah. So if you're providing, if we end up saying, in the case of the treasurer, that things have happened perhaps to suggest that some of the enterprises should be paying a little less. You see the overall general fund increase as 0.33%, a third of a percent. The overall budget, 0.09%. So, but if you look page after page after page and aggregate them, it's pretty much the same trend line. So, getting back to the rating, there's really four areas that affect the rating. The debt factors, as Dick pointed out, how much, how long, the speed of our repayment is critical, and the future plans. Just think logically, if you want to go out to borrow from a bank and you get a 30-year mortgage, or a 15-year mortgage, which one is likely to have the lower rating? The one that you're willing to pay back faster. So it's the same process in our issuance of debt. But we also, there's other reasons why we structure our debt the way we do, which probably takes a whole nother evening to discuss, but we'll touch on it later. The economic factors, the outside world, what's happening to the economy. If the state is having trouble because of economic conditions, how is that going to spill over to the municipal government is a factor. If the federal government is having problems, is that going to spill over to the local government? Well, in our case, it's hard to imagine, what would happen. That would be direct, but there are indirect effects. Raytheon closes. There are people who work for Raytheon that live in Concord. They can no longer pay their taxes. Tax delinquencies rise. These are the kinds of parade of horribles that the rating agency was asking a couple of years ago. And we were thinking, well, what difference does it make to us? Well, in fact, it does make a difference. So what's happening in the region and the larger world? The demographics of the community, probably key, aspect of our credit rating is the fact that you all live here. Some of you may think that's a benefit, or some of you may not. And then, so the limit, fourth factor is our actual operation, our actual track record. Have we messed it up? Or have we performed consistently in a successful financial fashion? So basically, this kind of a community should be a AAA rated community, but if management wasn't doing its job, it could be rated low. A few years back, Lexington was put on credit watch. That's kind of astonishing in itself. They rectified whatever it was that the rating agency found questionable, which I think was that the fact that they were using up their reserves to a level at which the rating agency became alarmed, saying, this is not your past pattern, what's going on? And so Lexington took a few years to specifically and forthrightly as a community objective to restore their reserves to the level that maintained their AAA.
Free cash?
Free cash, stabilization funds, whatever else is not being spent immediately counts. So we put, even though we're planning to use our stabilization funds, at this moment in time, they're sitting there as part of reserves. And that's what the rating agency is looking at. So that happens from time to time. So it's the fact that we have a AAA rating is probably a sign more of that we haven't done something wrong than that we've done something terrific. And the fact that the regional school district has a AAA rating is equally noteworthy, I think, for the same reasons. Management of the regional school district hasn't messed up what should be a strong operation. So, shall I move on? One other thing about enterprises, which is on page 12, with respect to how we look at our enterprises, then how we meet that objective of knowing that we are operating them successfully, is this discussion of using net income as a measure, as an annual and an ongoing measure of performance. If we found that the water fund, in fact, the sewer fund is the better example, if we found that, because sewer fund has had negative net income in recent years, if that was going to persist and draw down our net assets in sewer fund to a dangerous level, that could be a problem for the rater. So we're managing these funds looking at those kinds of measures, where obviously we're not managing the general fund to a net income test. I'm going to skip to page 18. This is just an extract. Virtually all of this stuff is either from the budget book, from the financial statements, from the official statement of a bond sale. It's in other documents, or from the finance committee report. So you'll find it in other places. This is in the back of the budget book. Our set of financial policies. These are basically the rules of the game that we're trying to follow. It's straightforward. It says what's our fund balance policies. what's our capital budgeting policies, enterprise fund policies, investment policies, and I'm sure we'll have more to add. This is still formative. I want to just say a few words about using the financial, the information that's in the financial statements itself. And Chris, you're welcome to take from the table. Financial statements are something that people probably mostly avoid looking at. Talking to the auditor for 15 minutes at the end of the year, the auditor says nice things, and this book never gets picked up, again. But it does say some very important things. There's a section that management discussion and analysis that precedes the statements that unfortunately is not as clear and plain as it could be, but there are some interesting things in it to glance through. The statements themselves are just pages of numbers unless you start delving into them. So I just want to point out just a few things. On page 23, this statement of net position is still relatively new. It was initiated about 10 years ago as an attempt to, by the Government Accounting Standards Board, a voluntary organization, by the way, that's funded by state and city governments, to avoid having the SEC start ruling state and local governments. But it was set up as a way to combine all of the town's activities. We basically think of ourselves as a set of funds. We've talked about them. We've talked about the general fund, the light fund, the water fund. They're all little camps. And this statement pushes everything into a consolidated set of numbers, which in just two columns: governmental activities and business type activities. Well, business type activities are obvious. They're just our four enterprises, our four real enterprises in one column: water, sewer, light, and duty. Governmental activities then is what? It's everything else. Everything else. It's the general fund. It's the parking fund. It's the CPA fund. It's gift accounts. It's everything else. And it looks at the town as a single entity. This is the statement on which you probably have heard we're showing now our net unfunded pension liability for the first time. And after June 30, for the statements of June 30, 2018, we'll be doing the same thing for our net OPEB obligation. Fully. This net OPEB obligation number here, $7,391,000, is only the amount by which we haven't funded our required annual contribution since we were obligated to start that in 2009. We've missed it by $7 million, so that's what appears on the balance sheet. Our full liability today, I don't have a current number today because we need to do an updated actuarial evaluation, but it probably would be an additional $20 million on the balance sheet. But this net pension liability is our full unfunded liability as measured by the rules of the GASB statements. So that number appearing here on June 30, 2015 for the first time, if you go down to the bottom of the page, you see what? You see a negative unrestricted fund balance of $779,000 for just about all communities. The appearance of the full pension liability for the first time on this balance sheet has pushed that number at the bottom of the page negative. What does that mean? Not sure yet. If you look at the next page, charted out, well, what is our net asset position. That seems pretty stable. And then we come to unrestricted net assets, and we have this huge drop in 2015, and that little bar is actually the 800,000 negative point. And I showed the same information, taking those OPEB and net pension long-term liabilities out of the picture, so I could look at it both ways. You know, what changed? Our assets actually declined even without that introduction of the pension liability, but we know why that happened. We used $3.5 million of MSBA grant money to pay off the bonds early in the refunding of May 2015. And Moody's knew that as well, although they asked again. So even though they know something, they still ask, they see if you can answer. So that's one thing to do, is look at these numbers without those liabilities and see and see if you can understand what's happening. And then on page 25, playing around with looking at all these numbers, you can see just a handful of other towns that we could quickly get data from their website, from their financial statements, and they're all reporting negative unrestricted fund balance on this net position statement. And so how do we measure that? How do we measure what that number means? One possible way is to compare it to total assets that are shown on the same balance sheet. The degree to which they are negative, in other words. Because we're talking about the need for future money. The pension liability is not something we have to pay tomorrow, but it's something we have to pay, ultimately. Again, it's a level of stress. It looks, from this picture, like Newton is in a fair amount of stress. It looks like Needham and Concord, maybe not so much. So it's just a way of indexing. It may not be the best way. It's the only way I've come up with so far.
What does it mean? Does it mean that someday we're gonna have to be paying these pensions out of current operating budgets?
Well, we may have to curtail, just like debt might be, just like stress and debt repayment might be a problem. It's the level of stress that might lead to a situation like that, where the only way you can meet your pension liability is by curtailing current operations. Exactly. Or raising taxes, and we have a tax limit, so we can't raise taxes unless we went to the voters and asked for an operating override. The first community that asks for an operating override to pay their pension liability is going to be interesting, but it probably will happen. So it's just a way to say, what does this number mean? And to what degree are we going to have to adjust our future finances in order to rectify this?
As a resident of yourself of Newton, how did Newton get in such a position?
Well, there's a couple of reasons why these liabilities are what they are. It could be that these, it doesn't happen in Massachusetts, but I'm thinking Pittsburgh, didn't, or New Jersey, didn't pay their pension liability, didn't make a payment to their pension fund when it was due. We don't have that latitude in Massachusetts. We are required by state law. PERAC, the Public Employee Retirement Administration, requires a funding schedule and issues us a letter based on our funding schedule that is a required appropriation, and we have to pay it annually. And so we're on a funding schedule that says if we do everything according to this schedule, and if we meet the investment return that the schedule had assumed, then by 2030, we'll be fully funded. Massachusetts is probably light years ahead of most states, even though we have some significant problems, significant issues. But the other, so the other way that, why Newton's in this position, probably mostly because of the choices that communities make about how they will, what benefits they will provide on the OPEB side, what benefits are provided, what contribution rate the town provides. Newton does things that are not required of the law.
So they're very generous.
They're very generous. On the pension side, there are ways in which you can adjust your funding schedule within limits, within parameters that the state sets, to push more cost out to the future, making your immediate contributions lower than future contributions, and still be a legitimate funding schedule. So,
Tony,
all of that.
would we still look so good if we consolidated with the region?
That's an interesting observation, and I'm trying to do that as well. There are a couple of situations where potentially a town that has that is part of a regional school district, where the regional school district is carrying the burden, would not be reflected in this data. Acton comes off looking pretty good, for example. And mostly that's because K-12 is region. And so we would have to combine our share of the Concord Carlisle Regional School District's liabilities to look at this fully. And glad you pointed that out, so you can turn to page 28. Now look at Concord Carlisle's numbers. What do you see?
A large negative.
Unrestricted.
Well, they have a large negative, but on this same measure that I suggested, of comparing that to their total assets, just as an index, it's 5%. Going back to the other chart, 5% isn't too bad.
No.
Right.
Now, Concord Carlisle happens to be, we are very lucky, we have our own retirement board. It's unusual for a town of this size, but it means we can manage our own money, it means we can make our own decisions. We're not part of a county system where the county board would set the discount rate and do the investing. And Middlesex County, which is the board we would be in if we didn't have our own, like 98 down the list of funded systems out of 105 boards. We don't want to be part of Middlesex County, but Carlisle is. But Concord Carlisle Regional School District is part of us. It's part of the Concord Board. And they're following the same funding schedule as we are. And on the OPEB, we know they're following, well, with, a few hiccups, they're following the same strategy on OPEB funding as the town is. So this number is more favorable than those other numbers that you were seeing. I can't say it's great, I can't say it's good, I can't say Concord is good. Just say that we're making more headway than others. And we are less in the hole than others. It's all relative.
So on the OPEB, we're increasing our yearly contribution to reach a certain goal, the annual required part. Once we do that, then part of this downward curve will pick up a little bit.
All other things being equal, but they never are. Yes, that would be the case. What's also happening is we're all using long-term rates of return, and they're not available in today's environment. So we're all assuming 7%.
It's gonna come back.
It's historically, we're not all using 7%, actually. Concord's using 7% on its pension. It's one of only 4 or 5 of the 105 boards that's at 7 or less. But, you know, we're using 7%, but we're not making 7%. So what happens? The next time you do an actuarial evaluation, the liability, the unfunded liability rises, even if you're doing everything well in terms of meeting your annual targets for budgeting. Every time you redo that funding schedule, your appropriation requirement is going to rise because the investment target's not being met. Our 7%, it's been a good target. It's been a good target looking backward. It may be a good target looking forward, if we look forward 30 years, or it may not. And we're increasingly coming to the conclusion that it may not. And so our board has had a strategy for the past 2 evaluations of taking our assumption down by 0.25%. Each time you do that, from 7.5 to 7.25, now to 7. And doing the valuation annually, and probably continuing to lower the discount rate assumption by 0.25% each time until we get to a level that seems more realistic for the near term, whatever that is. Moody's says 5%, for example.
Right, so it would take us 8 years to get
And
to what Moody's is
And it would
saying.
take about a $250,000 increment in the budget each time you do that. Because the new funding schedule is going to be about $250,000 more, require about $250,000 more funding for each 0.25% drop in the discount rate. That's our rule, rule of thumb measure.
What is the desired funded ratio? I'm looking at page 99.
Yeah. Great, we're way ahead. And we're at 80%.
We're at 80, yeah. So MWRA or REA, but,
They're a small system, relatively recent.
okay. So is Moody's looking for like a 90%?
No, Moody's,
funded rate?
Moody's again is looking at, okay, you've got a funding schedule. Well, when they do their numbers, they at 5%, they calculated us, and you'll read in the credit rating comment, they say, well, that's a moderate level.
Right.
Well, okay, I like the word moderate. That means it could be better, it could be worse. What are they looking for? They're not looking for any particular number. They're again looking at what's the overall impact and the risk to bond buyers of the town paying back its debt.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not unheard of that towns have not paid back their debt. Yeah, so that they have to be concerned about that. Or getting into, there are plenty of places that are in real messes at this moment, and they're not all in Massachusetts. In fact, there are a handful in Massachusetts. So it's a real issue. I would say we're going to see a deterioration of funded ratios across the board as each of the boards continuously updates their valuations during this period when we're not earning these assumed
Even
rates of return.
MWRA, they wouldn't be at 98% if they didn't have a 7.75 investment
Right.
return assumption.
Right. So when you look at these numbers, and I think I put it, where were you, Christine?
On page 99.
So
Yeah.
if Moody's were doing this, they would just give everybody the 5% investment
They give everybody
return.
5, they look at the numbers, they combine it with outstanding debt, they combine it with the open liability, they say, this total package, what's it look like? And even this table is inadequate to really compare. We stand at, Concord stands at 7th place on this list. If Lexington had done a 1/115 valuation, they would be below where they are. But even knowing just this information is not enough. There are other factors like the amortization rate of paying back the unfunded liability. So a legitimate funding schedule can still push more or less costs out to the future, even out to the limit year that you see here. We're using a 2% amortization. That means we have a certain amount of unfunded liability. We're going to increase our payment of the unfunded liability by 2% a year to get to 2030. Another community could, in this list, could use up to a 4% amortization liability. And then there are some exotic amortization schedules that PERIC has approved that have nothing to do with these normal things. And so analyzing just on this funded ratio, this first column, where people stand, actually isn't completely doable. But it's the best we have. And Concord looks
The
good, so-
reduction in the investment return assumption, the reason you're reducing it only 0.25% is just so it won't be too disruptive on the budget, rather than any assumption that it's going to only be reduced by 0.25%.
That's exactly right. What you see here is 1 year ago, we've just completed our 1/116
Yeah.
at 7. When we do the 1/117, probably we'll be looking at doing a 6 3/4. Because the budget can't handle
Yeah.
more than that. So just like we took the steps, the incremental steps to get the OPEB budget in place, we'll be taking a step, maybe 4 of them, maybe to get down to 6 ultimately, to get the pension budget higher than it is.
What kind of benchmarks are used to set that number? I mean, are we looking at, what can the S&P 500 return us? What kind of benchmarks are
We're still
typically
looking
used?
at, and we're relying on the expected rate of long-term rate of return is not 1%.
Right.
The expected long-term rate of return is still in the 6 to 7% range.
That's assuming a certain mix of.
Assuming our.
Fixed income.
A certain risk profile to
In
that.
our particular portfolio,
Yeah.
breaking it down by its categories and breaking it down by the expected long-term return on fixed income, expected long-term return on real estate or on stocks, global equities, U.S., large cap, small cap, it's itemized quite detailed. And the actuary has to avow that it's reasonable. And now the actuary has to review all this information because it's going onto the balance sheet. The auditor, has to review the actuary's work. We have to pay for that. So the audit fees have gone up. They all have to determine that it's reasonable. And yet, there are boards that are using 8, and somebody's making a judgment that that's reasonable. So,
Tony, is the effect of chasing a declining expected rate of return an increase or decrease in the unrestricted fund balance?
that will be the result, and you'll see it faster. Because under the normal pension or OPEB valuation process, you smooth out your gains and losses over typically 4 years, 5 years. So let's say we missed our target, and it was worth $4 million. You spread that over, as you're only going to recognize $1 million of that shortfall, in each of the next 4 years. The GASB rules for the financial statements require that we mark to market every year. So you'll see the full impact of the fact that we didn't make our 2015 target. You're going to see the full impact of that, basically full impact. There's still a little fudging, GASB fudging, not our fudging. You'll see the full impact of that in the next town financial statements. And so there is something in here, it's on page 29. Because I have the next GASB data for you to look at. It's not published yet, still working with the actuary to edit his report, but it will be available in a couple of weeks. So these are the numbers down at the bottom here that will show up on our balance sheet. Where in the fiscal 15, or the June 30, 2015 statements, the bottom of the page, you see the town allocation, general fund, $13,165,799. You go back to our balance sheet, that's the number that you saw. On page 23. That number is going to become $23,967,947.
It's impressive.
Up 10 million. So that's the impact of the GASB rules. Every year's results are going to be translated very quickly into the balance sheet.
So it's going to be more volatile.
Let's say this year, 2016, let's say the last few months, for some unknown reason, turn out to be fabulous. And we end up with a 10% rate of return. Yeah, we'll get them picked right back up in the following financial statements. So it will be volatile, or it'll keep going in one direction, you know. And if it goes in one direction, all I can tell you is Concord's still gonna look better than most others. Because we're still on a steady progression of confronting whatever the situation is and making the adjustments in the budget that will need to be made. And instead of doing biennial valuations, which is what we'd be required to do, we're going to look at it annually because this gets so complicated. If we waited only once every 2 years, it'd be really hard to figure out what's really going on.
So,
And by the way, this is all Carrie's problem.
nobody wants to get in a cycle where they're chasing their tails, but is there an argument to be made for a more aggressive reduction in the expected rate of return in order to avoid a sort of vicious cycle?
I think the issue of budget planning is preeminent here. That it's not necessary to do more than what we're doing, than what we're proposed to do more aggressively. I think that other communities are going to be in so much more dire position unless this turns around. If this market continues, that the pressure for something changing in the underlying system is going to come to the fore. So Governor Patrick tinkered around some of the pension system provisions. There's been no legislative interest in doing something more effective about the provision of health insurance coverage to retirees. Like which retirees, who retirees? Is a 10-year retiree, should 10-year retiree get, a person retiring with 10 years of service get the same benefit as a person retiring with 30 years of service? Those are issues that are floating around and have not been touched by the legislature. It's going to be hard for the legislature to avoid what I think is going to be coming along with these numbers. They're going to be hard to ignore. The numbers themselves are going to be hard to ignore because they will be so enormous. And there are communities that have done absolutely nothing in terms of, everybody has to do their pension funding because that's the state law. There's no state law that requires OPEB funding, and there are communities that have done none. And it's not a problem that's 30 years away, it's a problem that's 5 to 10 years
So
away.
we're talking about trying to do forward planning, which pretty much takes into account what we've seen as a long-term trend in a reduced return. So we're slowly, notching it down by small steps. Is there similarly pressure on the other side in some of these other communities who are facing much more pressure to change the risk profile of their investment pool, such that, we faced that problem in 2007 and 8 where they got into like really risky stuff like the CDWs and all this other nonsense, but I don't think that we're ever going back there. But how is the risk profile of the investment set? We have our own, but how is it generally done? How is
It's
that?
set by the board.
It's set by the board. You can't get outside a certain range of risk.
Well, they could, yeah. It's set by the board, but we can only do what PARAC allows us to do. So the real question is then, who is PARAC?
Yeah.
And do you trust them?
Right.
And, and I can say that, again, in Massachusetts, it's really structured more openly and more professionally than some other places. And so I don't have that kind of concern.
Okay.
The PRIT fund, the Mass PRIT fund is probably one of the better managed, professionally managed funds, even
Right.
though it's within a state agency.
Right.
And we're not doing crazy things, and we're not allowed to. And if we wanted tomorrow to buy some exotic thing, we couldn't without PARAC's permission.
So we're not going to be approached by derivatives vendors who are going to bring us all kinds of magic.
Right. We don't get cold calls anymore.
Oh.
We used to get.
You used to get that. We have this wonderful package of loans that we've repackaged. Okay.
This gives you the flavor of, and as to Christine's question, what's the target? Yeah, we want to be 100% funded. It doesn't look like it's going to happen anytime soon, because the more we do, it's like Alice in Wonderland, the more it recedes. The faster we run, the faster the universe expands. And
I'm assuming we don't make an assumption that every employee that we have currently will be eligible for retirement. I mean, in a sense that you're not maintaining your current population and expect them to stay with you until they retire and are
You are
eligible.
correct. It's all based on experience.
It's all based upon the experience, so.
Yes. 70% will retire at this age, 30% will move on, 20% will disappear, and so forth.
Tony,
And the spouse, somebody will choose spousal coverage.
just to follow up with Tom's point, how much havoc would it wreak in the budget if we were to, instead of do a quarter point a year, if we were, let's say this year, go to a half point reduction? You're talking 500,000, would that push things into override territory? Or?
I think it would push things into either
Eventually it would, right?
damaging adjustments to the town's operations, or override. An override in this environment is rolling the dice. I was going to say something else. So I think, and a board is composed of 5 members, and 2 of them are firefighters, and 1 is the town accountant, and 1 is a former FinCom chair, and then select board. So I think there's that question also. You want to bring the board along with a reasonable approach that doesn't seem to be, I could say, creating a crisis that that doesn't need to be created. So again, we could have 5 years ago said, well, we need to do this OPEB funding immediately. we need $1.4 million in the 2010 budget. You know, those are choices. I think the approach that's been taken is a reasonable one. And we have the same problem with OPEB, by the way. That assumes a rate of return,
Right.
and we're not making it. So we have accumulated $10 million. The more we accumulate, the more it's painful to not make the investment assumption.
There's nothing that says, though, that if the market took a downturn, that you couldn't up the rate, that you're reducing it, I assume. And then you're not locked into the quarter, that the decision made on an annual basis.
This is something that would be confronted by the board
Yeah.
each January as we give the actuary our instruction.
Yeah.
So we're in we're still funded at 80% according to the GASB rules. We were at 88% according to the GASB calculation. If this persists, then we'll drop into the 70s, you know. But 80% right now on this measure is the median for all, nationwide, for all defined benefit plans.
And we're looking at a 6.23 overall 10-year investment result.
We're looking
On page
at our
98.
performance.
Yeah,
That's our performance.
that's your
Over the
performance.
past.
That's our performance.
That's your capacity.
That's on page 98. she's
Yeah.
referencing this number. We're using the book exactly as I had planned.
I'm glad.
So these are statistics for 1, 5, and 10 years. So the first top column is what happened in 2015. Concord's 10-year compound rate of return is 6.23. Prim from the state fund is 5.86, and the composite for all 105 boards in the system is 5.93. That's what that means. So, looking back, nobody has met, at least on these averages, nobody has met the target that was being set, because over the last 10 years, it's probably closer to 8 was the median assumption. So,
One last question. How long have we been pushing this number down for, if we're going by these quarter point
Right.
drops?
The MD&A, the Management Discussion Analysis of the Financial Statements, has material, has a table, and if you, this book is online.
Yep.
Page 23, if you want to make a note. We were at 7.5, this is only the last 3 valuations. We were at 7.5 as of 1/1/12. We didn't move it as of 1/1/14, we moved it down a quarter as of 1/1/15, and now again as of 1/1/16. Before 1/1/12, if I had 1/1/10 here, it was at 7.75.
Okay.
So I think we'll move to something else.
Something more upbeat.
Something more upbeat.
Let's see. There is something I think interesting on page 35. As you know, we now have a financial audit advisory committee. The advisory committee is responsible for reviewing the audit process and the draft financial statements for both the town, the light plant, which is a department of the town, but has a separate audit report because it operates on a calendar year basis, reports on a calendar year basis as required to the Department of Public Utilities, or whatever they call themselves now. Or
Go back to TPU.
Go back to DPU. So, same auditor, and the same auditor does the regional, Concord Carlisle Regional School District. So the National Audit Advisory Committee is overseeing all three of those audit processes. And so this is just a note that I gave to the committee some time back. I've had a look at these various statements, and you may want to just read through this, because it sometimes looks like we have different sets of books. We have two sets of books here. The statement's called net position, and then you turn a few pages, and there's a statement called governmental funds, balance sheet, or something like that. And they're different, but you can actually use the same numbers to get from one to the other. It's a process of taking out certain things and putting in other things. And, the first statement, for example, one big element is that it records depreciation on governmental assets, the streets and the buildings, the water pipes. Well, the water pipes will be in the enterprise anyway. And the governmental funds is more traditional, where we're not recognizing those kinds of costs. And then we'll do something else for the state, which is called the Uniform Municipal Accounting System, which doesn't look like these statements. So we have at least three sets of records, but you can actually they're all using the same numbers. It's not one set of books for me and one set of books for you. It's one set of books. Just different things are added and subtracted from the various statements to fulfill the various requirements. The UMass system is probably the most, if I can use the word conservative, in the sense of we want to recognize expenditures quickly. We don't want to recognize revenues, as quickly. This governmental fund statement says we're going to recognize our revenues before we, perhaps before we collect them. Whereas the UMass is more kind of cash oriented. That's where the term free cash came from. It really was cash at one point. And then the top statement, the net position statement, is more like we're going to recognize every cost we can imagine, even the long-term costs, and we're going to call them current. We're going to treat them as if they're current.
Right.
And so that you get the full picture of, my goodness, we have negative unrestricted fund assets. So they're all connected, and there is even a crosswalk in the financial statements from the two that are in here.
Which statements do you find the most useful?
I think they do different things, and I think that the one I find least useful is what we give the state. But it's the thing that generates the certified free cash number, so it's pretty important. And then I stuck on page 37, the revised charge of the Audit Advisory Committee, so you could examine that. And at some time after you leave the Finance Committee, you can put that on your green card. Page 41, we talked about what the budget shows. I just put the treasure collector section in here. We've already talked about some aspects of it in terms of the funds, the fund charges. But every section in the budget book is doing the same thing. It's showing the organization chart, and the summary of expenditures, then showing an expenditure and funding plan detail. It's third page, it's showing the staffing, talking about program implementation, and you'll often, in most cases, see something in here on pages 3 and 4 of each division.
Sorry about that.
That addresses in some way a performance or activity metric of some sort, wherever we can. It's an evolving process. A lot of the survey data from the town's biennial surveys is then going to be reported in here where applicable. And so that's the routine for how the budget will be worked. On page 45, a section from the enterprise budget, which is the smaller book, done about 2 months in the 2 months following the publication of the town manager's book. And that's only because we don't have a large enough staff to do it simultaneously, or at least I haven't figured out how to do them simultaneously. So one follows the other, and this has its own public hearing then in March, usually before the April town meeting. And this is the pattern of what you'll see in every enterprise budget, where the emphasis is on operating expenses and operating results. But you'll still see the roster of authorized positions, and then an emphasis on page 47 on net income. So you see the water fund has significant net income, significant positive and stable net income. How do you determine whether that net income is, back to Linda's question, too much, too little? Are we charging too much for the rates? Are we not? Gets into what's available for capital spending. So the notion here is that to maintain the plant, we should be generating internal resources. Internal resources come from depreciation expense, the amount we charge for depreciation, and then set aside for capital spending, and the amount that's coming from net income, less the amount of bonds we have to repay. Bonding should only be when we expand the plant. So our thesis is that maintenance of the plant should come from users, and expansion of the plant may come from bonding. It doesn't have to, but it may. We shouldn't be using bonding to maintain the existing plant. We violate those rules here, around the edges, but that's the central principle that's here. So then we look at this net available for capital, and a few pages on, we have a capital plan, page 50. That's what we're matching up against. We're looking at how much is being generated to finance the capital expenditures that need to be made. In a nutshell. And the water and sewer funds in particular show you a 10-year schedule. That's on page 51 for the here. So in the book, you'll see a 10-year schedule for water and sewer. We don't have, I think we're developing a 10-year schedule for BD, but we don't yet have it yet for light. And here we're looking at the bottom of the page. Are we going to have cash at the end of the 10 years? Are we still going to have positive cash or working capital cash? If we don't want to have just like $1, because there wouldn't be enough working capital, and the general fund would actually have to make temporary loans, likely to pay the payroll or something like that. So we're looking for a sound working capital position. So those are the principles behind how the enterprise is put together. Let me go to page 57. We'll talk a few minutes about the general fund budget, which is the focus of your guideline process. And you see very simply, nothing surprising here, you all know this, 86% of the general fund is paid for by property tax. And only 4.3% is paid by state aid, a little bit from motor vehicle excise, some fund balance allocations, which in Moody's view is deficit financing, by the way. The budget should be financed by current revenues, not by past reserves. We allocate free cash and based on the premise of what we know we can restore, or what we feel confident we can, we never know, what we feel confident we can restore, and so that it circulates. Outlays, if I were to allocate the joint accounts on the left of the pie chart, to school and town purposes, every time we do that, we come up with about 65% of our money is education, and 35% is everything else. Allocating the debt, the group insurance, so, everything that's school-related to the school column, it comes out 65-35.
So that's not what shows up in the school budgets that we do in the guidelines. There's
No,
sort
again,
of
because
additional.
the town, we've consolidated, we've chosen to keep, for example, group insurance in the town budget, and not say, schools, here's your share, here's your 40% share of the group insurance budget for school employees. We'll just add it to your budget. I think there are obvious reasons that probably I don't need to go into of why we prefer to do it that way. But you'll see that detail there's a section of the town manager's budget that's just a 2-page summary of the CPS budget and a 2-page summary of the region budget. And it's, I didn't put it in this book, but if you look at page 283 of your town manager's book, you'll see at the bottom of that page, the town accounts, the portion of the town accounts that are school-related. Group insurance, OPEB funding, retirement, debt service, etc. It adds up to $8 million that's in the town budget that's school-related. So, I want to point out just one thing on page 58, which is a summary of the voted fiscal 17 budget. Which is that this is only as of what was voted April 4th and 5th. There are things here that are going to change. The appropriations won't change unless we have a town meeting, but the items below the appropriation that are listed as not appropriated will change. State assessments, that 501,852 was our estimate. The state budget has now been passed. We get new final numbers from the state. It won't be 501,852, it'll be some number close to that. Our budget plan had included an allowance for the possibility of a snow account deficit. Well, there was no snow account deficit. We didn't spend the entire snow budget this past winter, mostly because it didn't snow. And that $172,000 allowance won't be needed. So when we now go to set the tax rate in November, and you see the budget tables again, it won't be a $172,000 item. When I look at page 60, which is the revenue side, so the total won't be 98,425. 224, it'll be something less. And also, the mix of revenues might be different. State aid will be a final number. That was the 4,275,000 was an estimate. It looks like the number will be higher. It also looks like sometime this fall, we'll get the surprise announcement from the governor that state aid is being frozen, or something like that. Any of these other numbers will be looked at, and revenue numbers will be looked at to see if they should be modified at all, up or down, based on fiscal 16 results. And the number on line 42, new growth, will be probably substantially higher. The assessor will report sometime this month, tallying up the new growth data from the year that ended June 30, 2016, just a month ago. So they've assessed all property under construction or finished construction in the 12 months that ended June 30, and he'll give me that number, or he'll carry that number. But he already knows that it's going to be higher than 907, that there were substantial things that contributed during this past year. So that will lower the base property tax. It won't change the tax levy requirement, except to the extent the bottom line number is lowered, primarily because we don't need the 172, and because we probably will have a little bit more state aid than this number. So all these changes will be reflected in what you'll see in October leading up to the tax rate setting. But it looks like at this point, the tax rate, the tax levy, base tax levy impact, which was estimated at 4% in the FinCom report, will be closer to 3%. It'll be about a full percent taken off.
So I have a question about new growth. New growth you're showing here on a revenue basis, that's based, I assume, on building permits and other kinds of activity that would, what is it
No,
based?
it's not based, new growth is the increase in the taxable base.
Taxable base,
That
okay.
didn't exist the year before.
So let's say there wasn't a house on a certain lot, and now there is.
Right.
I'm sorry if I misrepresented my.
No, it's, a building permit is, it may or may not get.
It may not get built. That's fair enough. That's not really where I was heading with this. What's the experience of the town when new growth generates this new revenue? What's the relationship between that and the extent to which it impacts services delivered? My concern, obviously, is that we're a very residential community, and if you build a new home, and you plug in a new family, and they come in, and they have 3 kids or 2 kids, does that increase in new growth cover the 3 kids that just got plugged into the school system, for example? It's just a question. Is there a pretty reasonable relationship between the new growth that we see in tax revenue and the extra services that need to be handled for the new growth we see?
Yeah, there's a lot of ink that has been, used up in trying to come up with that. MAPC has dealt, has tried to write on this issue from time to time. I would say, in my judgment, over the long haul, yes. The answer is yes, they balance out. Because we're not dealing with, the time you get in trouble is when the growth is really sudden and major compared to what already was there. We're talking about 1% renewal rate in this town, basically, 1 to 1.5%. That's our new growth position. So it takes 70 to 100 years to replace the whole town, if you will. And I think we do probably have a natural limit on the population size that we could even cram in.
Well, I think like the Muse, just as an example, was a pretty big, for our town, that was a big development.
Yes.
And I don't know if it pays for itself in that regard.
That's a very complex question to answer. All I can say is, in the long haul,
Yeah.
it seems that we are continuing to function at good levels of service performance with the resources that we have available, part of which is coming from new growth.
New growth. Okay.
So that's not a definitive
No,
answer.
it's fine. I just,
I want to look at page 61, just to alert you. Here's that to emphasize, something you probably know, but to keep it in front of you, that the assessment ratio that's applied to a given budget is the enrollment of the October 1st in the year before that fiscal year started. So, for example, we don't know yet what the fiscal 18 budget ratios will be for our assessment from CCHS, Concord Carlisle assessment. We won't know until after this coming October 1st. We have an estimate that's been used for your fiscal forecast, NASDAQ, NESDEC enrollment projections, which I've included here, have forecast, they're somewhere here. They're on page on page 70. But they are reflected in the assessment ratios that I'm showing on table 62. So look at page 62 first. Annually, the school department has been doing this enrollment forecast. Years past, they didn't do it as frequently, but they've started to do it annually. So as of November 2015, NASDAQ forecasted the ratios you see here below the line. So the fiscal 18 assessment year, which is based on the October 1, 2016 enrollment, projected a 74.3% Concord ratio. That will change after October 1st, when we get actual information. We'll also get new numbers for the rest of the forecast and add a year to it. That's how this works. There are various ways in which this data is used, including looking ahead to allocate the debt service numbers and doing the FinCom's 5-year forecast. We'll use these numbers, whatever they are, and adjust for the new numbers, whatever they are. The forecast for the November 2015 data on page 63 is just charted. And you'll see that forecast assumed actually a dip in fiscal 17 or October 1, 2016, and then a rise, and then a little dip, and then a rise, and then I guess the forecaster got tired and just ran it out for you. So these shouldn't be treated as completely factual. Over the long span, they do turn out to reflect general movement and general position. But don't treat them as, these are absolutely what it's going to turn out to be, because they do wiggle around. There are calculations then on page 65 and 66 which show you how the debt is divided. The fiscal 17 debt service on page 65 is an actual budget. It's fixed. The assessment ratio of 73.61 is known. And actually, I see I did something wrong on the earlier chart. I should have changed it. That's why I was in trouble. The fiscal 17 number here on page 63 should have been a white square. That's fixed. What shows fiscal 17 as a dip is the dip to 73.61. So these numbers show the allocation of the $5,093,000 of CCHS debt in the fiscal 17 appropriation. The next page is just a projection. The debt service is correct, but the ratio of 74.3% for Concord will change after October. And this table will have to be redone. In the budgeting process, that'll be part of what you do. With respect to the CCRSD debt on page 67, it looks now presently as if there won't have to be any further borrowing for the high school financing. There is a ban that comes due next February, a $1.9 million ban by anticipation note. And we had conjectured last February that some part of that, not a major part, but some small part of that might have to be permanently financed. The present projection by the project manager, the final MSBA grant audit process and the final payment from MSBA should be sufficient that we've done all the borrowing we have to do. See if, I'd like to focus on page 77 on the levy limit. So that at present, fiscal 16, unused, you see on the right side of this chart, unused levy limit, 3,203,000, 4.07% of the levy limit is unused. That means we haven't taxed it from the people. We could have taxed up, we can only tax up to the levy limit without an override. We can go up to the levy limit without a vote of the people. We have not taxed up to the limit. On this other chart that you will look at later, of the credit comparison stuff, there is information and charts on this particular statistic of other communities, and Concord's in a relatively strong position in this regard. Having a little margin up to the levy limit that we haven't used, that we haven't called upon, and the rating agency has also taken note of that in the reports that you have read. So there's no magic about this. The town meeting could have appropriated more. The guideline process is not really driven by the levy limit. It's driven by what you see as the tax impact and the needs. So, but many communities are operating right at the levy limit. Questions about that? All right.
But I mean, don't we try to control the guideline process and I mean, we do look over the long term that we don't want to get to the levy limit. Or
Well, and your 5-year projection does that.
Right.
And I guess your 5-year projection
If we-
right now has anticipates that after 5 years, we may be at the levy limit. Yes.
If we were to increase, what, 4%?
4%.
Yeah.
I just point out on page 88, for fiscal 18, we'll be right around $6.5 million is the bottom line there, the net from the property tax levy after applying stabilization fund resources. And it stays there at $6.5 million, and then starts declining. Except that before we get there, we'll probably be doing something else. But this also shows you the planned use of the remainder of the high school debt stabilization fund. And I haven't, and the note here says I haven't updated this table yet, completely. I put in here on page 91, because it's a current community concern, just a reminder about the overall school transportation facility project. And attached in the next page, the article again, just to remind folks that this is the town manager's project. It's being constructed by the Public Works Department of the town. It's not a school committee project, though I'm sure they're deeply interested. It's not a project that they are building. It's a project that, that the town is building, town manager is building, and the project bids came in tight, not either too high or too low. It would have been nice if they'd come in lower, but they came in at a level that the appropriation can support. And there were a couple of alternate things, like the fueling facility, which were bid as alternates. If the project goes well, there's budget allocations for contingency. If that contingency doesn't need to be fully utilized, the Public Works Department will go out with another bid for that additional facility within the $4,125,000 that's available.
So the bid that came back did not quote on those alternates, it just,
Right.
okay.
Well, it did.
Yeah.
It did.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
So then why'd you say they're gonna go out with another bid?
Because
Doesn't include the,
Because at this juncture of the project, we've needed to preserve the contingency.
So you have to rebid them because you're not taking the alternates that were included, okay, that's all, that's fine.
So I just wanted to just review and update that. The,
I'm sorry, can't the alternate be added as a change order or
so
something?
when you award the initial bid, only at that time.
Okay.
I'm also pointing out that that 1.95 million was, that the $1.95 million borrowing was authorized and voted as a debt exclusion at the April special election. So that item was not added to my excluding debt table yet. It would have to be, probably will be borrowed with next spring's bond issue. Let's talk about pension funding. And, I think there's too much to talk about with OPEB funding. Page 106 is the June 30 position of the OPEB trust. And the activity for fiscal 16 is illuminating. We added $1,780,000 to the fund. That was from the direct appropriation that we made, the $1.4 million that was budgeted, plus monies that were available in the group insurance account, as the committee discussed before, plus the enterprise fund shares. But you see, investment gains was a negative. So for the 12 months, we actually lost money on this investment. Over the life of this fund, we still are up $1.4 million in investment gains, but that's not meeting the assumption. So when the OPEB valuation is done, just like the pension valuation is done annually, this will tend to increase the annual required contribution. So it's not as if we've reached 1.4 million and that's it. That number may still go down. Um, But the good news is the snow account, on page 12. On page 112, where for the third time in the last 10 years, we've had a snow account surplus. This is probably going to be more volatile going forward, of years in which it doesn't snow at all and years in which we get 10 feet of snow. So, but our budget strategy remains intact, of trying to meet the 10-year average. And you see that in the snow appropriation gradually being increased year by year.
When we end up in a deficit year, this being my first year on this committee, do we end up making emergency fund appropriations through this committee to meet
No,
these?
That's, so in the budget guideline process, that's where the allowance, the allowance for a possible snow account deficit is built into the guideline itself.
Okay.
And that's the $172,000 that we now don't need.
Right.
And can take out of fiscal 17's.
So you just keep it on account as a, no,
It's not really, it never was cash.
never cash.
It was the assumption that we'd have to add it to the tax levy in the next year.
Okay.
Now we get a little bonus for the taxpayer, not, so it will have a little less of a tax increase than was anticipated in the FinCom report. But whatever the deficit is, it can be added to the next tax levy.
Okay.
As long as the basic appropriation is equal to or greater than the previous year. It's the only account that we are allowed by state law to overspend, as I say, without going to jail.
Okay.
Why was there a reserve fund transfer in 2009?
Because, I don't remember, but probably because I violated my own rules. I really do not remember. It was a big year.
Yeah.
So we may at that point have decided that there was a limit to what we wanted to add to the next levy. Even though we could have added the entire amount to the next levy. And lastly is the exercise that we've been trying to do annually, and this goes back to Linda's comment about adding the regional school district liabilities, to for the OPEB and pension. And that's what this is doing. That's what this sheet is doing, to look at the regional school district and the town together. And it's a big number of $150 million as of June 30, 2015, and it will be a little bit lower, not much, for June 30, 2016, as our principal, as our debt principal came down. Some of these, it may actually be about the same. I'm looking at it now and saying, well, the unfunded pension's going up by 10 million, so it probably is going to look pretty much the same. But, and I'm trying to think about how do we think about that number and comparatively, and it goes back to our earlier exercise. It's, on the general fund side, it's about 1.25 times our annual budget. And if I were to do this kind of thing for Newton, which you might not be surprised that I have, it works out to about 2.5 times the annual budget. So thinking, well, we could relate it to that in terms of getting a sense of what it means. I think we're in a moderate position. We're not, this is not a great number, it's not a terrible number, it's a manageable number. It's a manageable level.
If you look at this, say, compared to Social Security and Medicare and sort of their funding levels, how is that? Can you do that?
Oh, goodness. Yeah, I'm sure it can be. I haven't approached that yet. I've just been working with municipal numbers at the Massachusetts level.
You know, and then I wondered what their discount rate, I mean,
Interesting question. I don't think they do that. I don't think they're actually they're doing a cash flow. They're saying, we have enough to pay benefits until 2030 or 2040, and after that, we have enough to pay 75% of benefits until 2090 or something like that. They're doing it just strictly on cash flow. What's coming in, what's going out. They're not investing it.
Well, they do have some
they have a
built
trust
up,
fund.
they have a trust fund, so that something's happening there. They're loaning that back out to the federal government
It's not
and
a
getting
trust-
some return on that.
It's not a trust fund that BlackRock is investing.
No.
It's an accounting mechanism. All the cash is spendable in the US Treasury.
Right.
But doesn't it accrue some?
It does.
Income to the,
They probably give it some interest credit
yeah,
Right.
at 1%, it
on the
probably,
books.
at probably some very modest, especially in the present interest environment, I'm sure they're giving it some, Federal Reserve, type.
I don't know, I just thought about,
But again, that's also, it's also just a bookkeeping entry, it's not,
right.
You've said that our pension is, we manage it, there's like 105 pension systems in the state, and we have our
Same
own.
system.
Yeah, what's that? Yeah.
in the same state system.
State system. And we have our own, which gives us a little more latitude than if we were to participate in Middlesex. What does the region do? Do they throw in with Middlesex? Do they have it with
No, the
us?
region's part of the Concord Board.
Okay, they are within the Concord. Board.
Carlisle is not, but the region
The region
is.
is. Okay. Cool. Interesting. Okay.
More questions?
There's always more questions, but I
My head is just
think,
filled.
Well, there's, I hope that this is a reference document. It's challenging to, I just want to show you where stuff is, where, information is. These other things are resources, even if, I'm sure everybody in this room has read the FinCom report, but there might be citizens out in the community who haven't, and it's a resource, so.
And a lot of the numbers are out of everybody's control, and how much it snows, the rate of return, there's how the market is doing. You can do numbers over time, but there's, year by year, there's a certain amount that's just not within your
Right.
control.
You plan, and then you adjust to where the plan shows that you need to change,
And control what you can control.
and you plan again.
I guess the other side we don't usually look at is just sort of our infrastructure too, which I think if we compare ourselves to some other towns as well, we have a handle on, but in terms of the planning for infrastructure, are there any things that we should be thinking about over time in terms of sort of financial guidance there.
Yeah, I think we actually can see what's, broadly happening.
They have it in their 10-year plan, don't they?
Cap-
In their-
we have the capital
their
plan.
The capital
But that would
plan.
be
But that's
their
just
infrastructure for the most
specific,
part,
yeah.
I would think. Because they're spending money annually on the day-to-day upkeep, and then they've got their 10-year plan on what they need to replace.
For the enterprises, we can see that in their net asset position. For the town overall, that's sort of what we're striving to illustrate on page 24 when we looked at that chart, the net assets. Because this is drawn from the statement of net position that is recording depreciation expense. And so if you saw this line dropping, it would signify that you're not replacing anything. We're charging ourselves for the using up of our streets and all the other infrastructure that we have, all the other general fund infrastructure that we have. And if this line, if you weren't doing any replacement, this line would decline. It's not declining, it's rising. Granted, the depreciation is at historical cost, and so that's always the challenging thing. But that's why we're looking at this measure. To say what's happening to our total net assets. And we're measuring and we're looking at the enterprises in that same way. So on a global, when I ask the water superintendent how much money he needs to actually replace the water pipes under the ground, he says probably about 3 times what I have, and we're doing 3 times as much as anybody else. On a street basis, we're replacing our streets and our pipes on kind of a 75-year schedule. Is that too long, too short? And the result is what you see out there. Do we have, yes, we have some water main breaks occasionally, but not to the degree of other places. We have a pavement index that's, tries to be at that 80%, 80% mark, solid B.
As far as that goes, and that raises a different question, do folks like water and sewer have ideas about expanding the services that are out there? Particularly, water covers probably over 80% of homes. It's a very high number, but sewer does not. And it's, we have issues with the capacity and the state regs in terms of how much we can process and all the rest of that. So I'm not really going to get too deeply into that. But there's other infrastructure, gas lines, which are owned by private entities like National Grid. Are there plans in place to, sort of push that out to cover more with the water mains, or to get more folks on gas lines, or is this anything like that enter into the planning process? It's probably more of a question for Chris.
Well, it is.
I know the gas, we're not involved in the gas decisions at all.
Right.
Although we press for them to fix their leaks, and so they've actually sort of shifted their focus from expanding their system to new customers to
Right.
fixing their leaks. So they're actually turning people down or making them pay the full cost of providing service to the extent line extension.
So if we tear up a road, let's say, and we're doing like a full rebuild of a 2 miles a year, 2.5 miles a year, and the gas line goes this far, do we go to National Grid and say, hey, by the way, we're gonna take this whole road up, would you guys please put this in, or?
We do, we tell them a year in advance where, we have a 3-year plan for what roads we'll be working on.
Yeah.
And we tell them at least a year in advance, and maybe as many as 3 years in
Right.
advance, what roads we'll be working on. They consistently say, yeah, we're all set in that area, and
But they do nothing.
the day after we finish paving, they say, okay, we would like to do this. So, we go through the exercise, once in a while it works.
Okay, all right,
But not regularly. On the sewer system, there's it's about 30%, I think the community's about 30%
Right.
sewer. We're not really looking to, at one point, we had a multi-phase sewer system, some of you might remember, it was with the White Pond area.
White Pond areas, yeah, that was a big
And,
deal.
The state has actually changed its focus and would prefer, I think, septic systems and groundwater discharge to recharge water back into the ground, not discharge it out to the river and
Right.
send it out to the sea.
Right.
So we sort of rethought that, and right at the moment, we're doing some infill where we have sewer lines existing, connecting people that weren't connected in the past, but we don't really have any plans to extend sewer lines.
I think White Pond would be a good play, because those houses are all, now they've gone from being summer to
Yeah.
year-round, and they're right next to that resource.
So if it was ever done, it would probably be more of a community septic system, located a little bit removed from the pond, but
Yep.
not shipping it out to the.
I see, not, okay. Thanks, Richard. Infrastructure, oh, man.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you, Tony. That is very helpful. Seventy-five-year horizon, that's a good horizon. Do we have to turn this off, the system here?
Little information.
How are you doing?
Thanks. That's great.